All right, so this is my presentation on funds of knowledge that has been collected through data that I've acquired just formally through interviews with students using the funds of knowledge questions, as well as informally through my observations over the course of the past couple months, in which I observed what students were interested in and what kind of experiences they brought to the classroom, specifically using the two categories of funds of knowledge: popular culture and general knowledge. So to begin with, popular culture, what is it that my students love? When they go home every day, what are the things that they invest their time into in the popular media? Uh, so, the first thing I asked them about was their reading. What is it that my students are reading? A lot of them, for fun, generally would express that books they've enjoyed reading are a lot of YA novels like Harry Potter or The Hunger Games, but also, certainly some older texts like Game of Thrones. And books from class every now and then were mentioned, books that generally tend to be popular books read in the classroom, like To Kill a Mockingbird or The Great Gatsby. And when I asked my students why exactly it was that they enjoyed these books, the answers I got most commonly had something to do along the lines of it being a story that made them want to keep reading. So with the Hunger Games, they would say that they couldn't put the book down, or they really liked the characters or enjoyed the drama of maybe a love triangle in the narrative that they were reading. I also had students mention that their primary reading when they go home or on their free time is, reading stories online, whether that be through Reddit and posts and kind of commenting and engaging in that way. So, on top of reading, I also ask my students what exactly it is that they watch on TV, and overwhelmingly, the answers that I found through my interviews and just through listening to my students talk in classes was Rick and Morty was an insanely popular show at Henry Clay High School. It seems like nearly every kid, boy or girl, enjoys this show for the characters and just for the wacky humor in it. I think it's a pretty straightforward reason why, as well as Stranger Things, because of its popularity right now. Everybody was overwhelmingly drawn to these shows as some of their favorite. But they certainly mentioned other shows like Keeping Up with the Kardashians and This Is Us. But I think the thing that my students in general were drawn to with these kinds of shows and what they kind of expressed was um, shows that were bingeable in a way. So shows that one kind of compelled them to keep watching in large quantities. I mean, I had a lot of my students who spent all of Halloween weekend just watching Stranger Things in one sitting. And so that kind of, I think, resonates with how this current generation consumes media and consumes entertainment and art, and it's in these mass quantities. And if that is how it is done, then the expectation for these television shows is for them to be an entertaining enough thing to make them want to keep going episode after episode. But I think that relates to English as well, and I'll get to that. Movies, interesting thing that I found from my interviews with my students was that not a lot of my students go to the movies as much anymore. There tended to be more excitement towards television than movies in this sense. A lot of the students that I interviewed kind of expressed that they don't really go to the movies that often, but when they do, some of their favorite movies that they mentioned tended to be, maybe Frozen or some Disney animated movies. A lot of superhero movies mentioned: Thor Ragnarok, Guardians of the Galaxy. So it would seem that the stories that dominate the movies that my students are going to see as of late are these huge action set piece blockbusters and superhero movies that kind of own the industry as a whole. So that's, I don't think, terribly shocking. But the reason why they like these movies is because they're fun, they're entertaining, and I think to a certain degree it's the escapism value of it. So, excuse me, in regard to music, uh, another overwhelming category in terms of the answers I got, so many of my students are drawn towards hip hop music and rap for the lyrics or for the beats and the songs. They gravitate towards this music in an overwhelming sense. Certainly, they also gravitate towards pop music. I had students who I interviewed say Taylor Swift or, Ariana Grande, Selena Gomez, artists like that. Classic bands, every now and then you have a student that likes to kind of be cool and they think countercultural and is more interested in, music from the 60s or 70s. And I had a student who kind of mentioned that and said that they liked the Monkees, which kind of tickled me. So I put that on here. um, Video games. This was the thing that I was really fascinated in terms of asking my students, because there certainly are a lot of video games that kind of have a narrative that you could almost argue is a text-based kind of narrative. Now, a lot of my students, primarily a lot of my girl students who I interviewed, they don't play video games often. Certainly, a lot of them said that they might play Mario Kart, Mario Party, things like that. Smartphone games were popular with my students, so Candy Crush and a bunch of whatever the game is at any given week that's popular. A lot of guy students mentioning that they love playing NBA 2K basketball or Call of Duty first person shooters. And I had a good amount of students also mention interests in Legend of Zelda, the Nintendo Switch, which just recently came out, or video open world video games with large, expansive worlds and immersive characters and storylines. And I think that resonated with me in a very fascinating way, which I'll get to in a moment. In terms of cell phones, my students, I kind of asked them what exactly they use their cell phones for. And primarily what I gathered from this information and just from seeing what my students are always on when they're on their cell phones in class, uh, they consume Snapchat as their primary means of using their cell phone. It's even for a lot of them their primary means of communication, even more so than text messaging. And certainly they use text messaging to plan things with their friends or communicate with their parents. And it's not a crazy statement to say that my students consider their cell phones a primary source of information in their lives. So how can I use this information? Um, my students have kind of expressed the things that they're interested in, and there was a theme in all of the things, whether it be literature, whether it be reading or television or movies or even video games. And for a lot of those, it tended to be uh, characters that felt relevant and engaging to them, something that made them want to continue watching and spend time in a given world, with whether that be the escapism of a world like the Marvel universe or the characters and story of Stranger Things that keeps them wanting to read forward, or the Hunger Games. So what can I use with that information? For me, that means taking a long, hard look at the kind of texts I assign my students, and see how they'll respond to them and see if these are texts that are relevant to them. And certainly, when relating it to Dr. Burns's empowering struggling readers, I need to be conscious that just because my students, favorite shows are Stranger Things and Rick and Morty doesn't mean that the things they should be teaching are Rick and Morty and Stranger Things per se. But certainly it does mean that I need to look at why they enjoy these things and what makes them relevant to them, and finding things that are incorporated into my classroom that bring this kind of relevancy. In terms of hip hop music, a lot of my students love this kind of music, and I've incorporated that into my poetry unit for next semester, allowing them to use hip hop music or whatever music they like to kind of um, analyze as though it's poetry and kind of point out literary devices and study of that. And I think certainly this is a relevant way to engage with my students. Dr. Burns on page 77 of Empowering Struggling Readers said, studies found that using popular culture texts, especially music, help students feel more able to engage with their peers in a way that supported their identities, increased their sense of efficacy as readers, and therefore supported higher levels of engagement and reading achievement. So certainly this is something that I'll want to be considering in my classroom, but not just with music, with different texts, not necessarily just teaching the classics that are mandated by the state, and even exploring the possibility of are video games a text? Certainly, a lot of video games nowadays have these expansive narratives. And if there's a specific student I have in my classroom that is really passionate about this artistic storyline of a video game he's playing, maybe I can find a way to arrange a way in which a project or a study that he does in the class could focus on that, and he can analyze that because that's what he's passionate about and interested in. And who am I to deny him that as a text that could be useful for his learning? Um, so what is my students' general knowledge? This was the other funds of knowledge I focused on. Where have my students been? I talked to my students about where they'd traveled, and overwhelmingly students said that they had been to Florida on vacation with their family. A few would say Chicago, maybe New York, Disney World. Generally, the places they had traveled to had been for vacations with their family or visiting family somewhere else. But where do they want to go? I had a lot of students express wanting to go to California. I had a student talk about wishing that he could live in London once he graduates and go to school there. I had a lot of students say Disney World because it appealed to them in a sense of it resonates with a lot of the characters they grew up with. But the thing that was interesting about both California and England is both of these kind of indicate my students' desire to experience the world and kind of go to places they haven't been before, and kind of this sense of independence by going out west. Um, so, what are my students concerned about in the world? What are the things that they consider important right now? A lot of them mention Trump and the politics in our country right now, the racial dynamics in our country, and the racism that's kind of sprung out of Charlottesville and other events like that, global climate change, and the North Korea nuclear crisis, I guess you could call it. And certainly, all of these things apply to my students in a way that the reason why my students care about these events is because they feel like they're impacting my students' lives. They feel, and certainly many of them do. One of my African American students, said that he felt threatened by the events of Charlottesville and felt like he was being attacked personally by that. Whereas other students felt like the environment was, in the long run, going to affect them and their children. And these are things that apply to their lives. Who do they see as influential? Politicians, athletes, celebrities, for better or for worse. These people, they said the reason why they felt these people were influential is because they're paid attention to by a lot of the population of our country. We listen to what celebrities say and to what Donald Trump says, or any other politician, or an athlete like Colin Kaepernick, who can start a movement with taking a knee during the national anthem. So as I already kind of discussed, what makes them pay attention to current events is sort of, things that feel relevant to them and things that feel like they're immediate and urgent in their personal lives, or just things that people are talking about around school. One of my students says the reason he'll start caring about an event when it's something that people are talking about, or when it's something he's hearing about, because then he feels like he needs to know what's going on. How can I use this information? Like my previous information that I found through popular culture, I need to recognize that my students are very informed in terms of what's going on in the world, and they care a lot about issues like this. They care a lot about like what happened in Charlottesville, or what's happening in North Korea, or what's happening in office. And I think it's my job as a teacher to recognize these concerns and see what we can explore in the classroom related to those. If my students are concerned with racism, what kind of text can I present to them that will get conversations generating and getting students talking about these issues together? If my students are passionate about things, who am I to deny them the ability to talk about those? I think that the curriculum I assign needs to utilize that in some way. With my unit project next semester on poetry, I'll be focusing on love leading into Romeo and Juliet. And that's certainly something that's a subject of passion to a lot of my students in a lot of different ways, whether it just be understanding and learning what love means to them in high school, whether that means, you know, the conversation of same-sex marriage and homosexuality, and uh, the kind of the changing definitions that we have of love in our society, and this broadening of our acceptance, and kind of talking about that and finding texts that can help us explore these subjects. Um, so certainly I want to consider the experiences of my students and where they come from. In his essay on experience and education, Dewey said on page 36, the utilization of subject matter found in the present life experience of the learner is perhaps the best illustration that can be found of the basic principles of using existing experience as a means of carrying letters onto a wider, more refined, and better organized environing world, from which educative growth sets out. Um, so essentially, what Dewey is saying here, and what makes all of this important, is the experiences of my students and their interests and passions inform my classroom whether I recognize them or not. But if I recognize them and if I see what my students are interested in, what they love, I can better target them as individuals and set up an educative experience in which I'm engaging my students. And that relates back to, I think, Dr. Burns's engagement perspective, in which we consider our students' interests, their prior knowledge, um, and allow them to have choice and variety, allow them to have kind of autonomy and collaboration and all of those different components of engagement in the classroom, and incorporate those into their funds of knowledge. So all of this kind of comes into factor in a way that makes my classroom more effective and more enjoyable for them. Because English, I believe, for a lot of these kids, could certainly be enjoyable and engaging to them if we only listen to what draws them to the subject matter in the first place. So that is all. Thank you.